We'll resume our study of Joshua by examining the historical context. In the period of time where Joshua is presented, we find that there was a power vacuum in Palestine. What we intend by this is to convey that to the south, the influence of Egypt is fading. As you may be gathering by this point, from time to time there were periods when Egypt was the dominant force in Palestine. This would have been true, say, in the 1500s. In this period, however, there is a slump. We learn of this through a group of letters known as the Amarna letters. These were discovered in Egypt. They were sent from Palestine, from leaders in Palestine who were supervising that territory for the interest of Egypt. They are sending messages to the south, to Egypt, saying, things are not going well for us here. In effect, if you really are interested, Egypt, in maintaining your hegemony over this territory, you need to prop us up. You need to send us things that will help us repel those who are attacking. There were armies that were spoiling these lands that Egypt was controlling. The Amarna letters tell of invasions by a people group known as the Habiru. Some suppose that these may have been the Hebrews, which is the foreign name for Israel, but the Habiru they turn out to be warriors. At times they operate as mercenaries, marauders, caravaneers, and they're not limited to this territory, but rather range all over the ancient Near East. So the correlation with biblical Hebrews, that is the Israelites, is not a real clear correlation, although it's tempting due to the similarity of the sound. We encounter within the book of Joshua something known as cherem, and this means for a commodity or a person to be devoted to the ban, that is, a prohibited person or a prohibited commodity. This winds up meaning that spoils, for example, taken from cities of Canaan are to be given to God in certain instances. We see this especially in the case of Jericho, the Gateway Campaign, when God says no one is to take any booty from that city, but all of it, all of the prize treasures are to be devoted to God. That's what Achan or Achan trespassed. Cherem talks about then persons or commodities which are exclusively devoted to God. As we come to the theological context just shortly, we'll be discussing this sort of feature a little more fully. But at this point, we want to look to nearby cultures and notice that, for example, according to records in Ras Shamra, Syria, we are aware of cultic practices that would have been very, very harmful for their communities and consequently things that God prohibited. These kinds of practices were going on in Canaan. Some of them that were named and prohibited included ritual, that is, religious prostitution, where prostitution was engaged at religious sites with an eye towards furthering the favor of a deity in that region. Just imagine the mayhem that these kind of engagements would give rise to. Also, child sacrifices we know were practiced in these territories. And it was activities such as these that caused God's judgment to fall on these territories, bringing to a close these particular communities, since in effect their time had run out. Let's turn now to theological reflection on the book of Joshua. I'd like to begin by asking you to jot down, is there anything in the process of studying and reading the book to this point that has made us uncomfortable? Anything that you find you don't know how to deal with, it doesn't fit into your understanding of the character of God, the priorities of God, the kind of commands that God would give. I have a hunch there are some things that make you uncomfortable, probably more than one. Please pause the video at this point and jot them down. And if possible, jot down alongside how you might endeavor to work through those. How do you deal with them within this book or the larger message of Scripture? Please pause the video at this point and jot down some ideas. All right, you've got those written down. Let's proceed forward in this discussion. I wonder if these may not be two of the problems or the uncomfortable features which you found yourself writing down. The first has to do with the conflicting messages that we find within the book itself concerning fulfillment of God's promises, or on the other hand, the evidence for the lack of fulfillment of those promises. A second, which very likely you may have written down, is a distinct sense of discomfort with the degree of violence that is portrayed in the book of Joshua. These are two that are very important for this book and worth our considering a little more fully. Let's take the first then, the conflicting messages concerning fulfillment of promises or lack of fulfillment of promises within the book of Joshua. Let's take a look at a couple of statements that express fulfillment. From chapter 21, towards the close, in verse 45, not one of all the good promises that the Lord had made to the house of Israel had failed. All came to pass. A little bit earlier in the same passage, we could add to that summary statement. Verse 43, God gave to Israel all the land that he swore to their ancestors. They took possession of it. God gave them rest. Verse 44, not one of all their enemies had withstood them. This seems to be a statement of universal fulfillment of the promise to give the land to Israel. When we come now to chapter 23, verse 14, we find a similar expression. Joshua is indicating that he will soon exit this life. And now, he says, I'm about to go the way of all the earth. And you know in your hearts and souls, all of you, that not one thing has failed. Of all the good things that the Lord your God promised concerning you, all have come to pass. Not one of them has failed. A reflection, a recap, looking back, and an affirmation that everything has been fulfilled, universal fulfillment of God's promises to this point. And yet, within this same book, we find several passages where there is the attestation of the lack of all lands or all peoples being given over to Israel. There are some pockets of resistance. Just so that we may see some of the specifics, we'll turn to these passages, beginning with 13, verse 1. Back in chapter 13, Joshua is old, advanced in years. The Lord says to him, "You're old and advanced in years, and very much of the land still remains to be possessed." And then there's the listing of these various regions and cities. Now, perhaps from this passage, we would understand that everything was fulfilled. That is to say, these regions unfulfilled were solved by the time we get to the earlier verses in chapter 21. After all, this is chapter 13. Joshua is old at this point, but he hasn't reached the time frame of chapter 21, when he is soon to die, according to his own words. May I direct your attention now to chapter 16, verse 10. This is talking about the territory of the Ephraimites. And we read here in verse 10, "They did not, however, drive out the Canaanites who lived in Gezer. So the Canaanites have lived within Ephraim to this day, but have been made to do forced labor." Now, when we encounter this phrase, "to this day," most likely this indicates at the time of the writing of the book, which encompasses the death of Joshua, there in chapter 24. This then is an acknowledgement of an exception to the universal inheritance conquest of the land. There was a pocket in this town of Gezer they were subdued, the Canaanites living there made to do forced labor, but it doesn't sound quite the same as the phrase, no people were able to withstand them. Perhaps even more explicit is the statement about the inhabitants, the tribe of Manasseh, in chapter 17, beginning with verse 12. Yet the Manasseites could not take possession of those towns, but the Canaanites continued to live in that land. But when the Israelites grew strong, they put the Canaanites to forced labor, but did not utterly drive them out. So here's a situation where, once again, there seems to be a discrepancy between the statement that the promises were totally fulfilled without opposition, and then, on the other hand, an acknowledgement there were some places they were not able to conquer. Israelites were not strong enough at that time. Next, I'd like to offer some perspectives concerning these evidently conflicting statements within the same book. By virtue of the author retaining both messages within one book, universal fulfillment and yet particular exceptions to universal fulfillment, it seems that we are intended to infer from this that the messages of universal fulfillment are statements viewed from a very high altitude or a very broad brush stroke. And that's what I wish to suggest by point C, subpoint 1. Here we have fulfillment of the promise that Israel, descendant of Abraham, would at last possess this land. And indeed, they are there. That has been fulfilled. A people which had, against all odds, since they were slaves in Egypt, they were not a unified force, and so against these incredible odds, they have been set free from Egypt and then moved into this land, and we should just be utterly amazed that such a thing should take place, and it has taken place. They are the dominant force, the dominant people. They are at home in this land. It has been fulfilled. No longer does Abraham, obviously long deceased, but no longer does he have simply a tomb for his wife. No longer does Jacob just have a toehold. But, my goodness, the nation of Israel has been birthed and they have moved in. How can we say? It's as if the writer would say, well, how can you say that this is anything but just a gleaming fulfillment of this promise that is centuries old, starting with the promise to Abraham? Without question, it has been fulfilled. So it seems that the statements within Joshua, which are expressed with this kind of universal, shall we say, a broad brushstroke, these are intended to be seen as generalizations of this grand scheme fulfillment. Generalizations meaning not every pocket of resistance has been canceled, but the promise completely fulfilled because, my goodness, there they are. They are in this land, and you would have never thought it possible. Now, subpoint 2 under letter C, conditional fulfillment. Now we're zeroing in on these cases of non-fulfillment and saying there are some reasons why that happened. Think of a few of them, for example, that I've lined out here. First of all, when you have the large group of people being faithful, but yet there are some particular subgroups within Israel, like the family of Achan, the person and family of Achan, being unfaithful, then you're going to see some places where there will not be complete victory. After Achan committed his treachery through greed, burying some gold seized from the booty secretly from Jericho, hiding it under his tent, and then the troops go out thinking that God will again give them victory against the next town, Ai, and instead they are trounced And Joshua is in great consternation. What has gone wrong here? It's because there was a pocket within Israel that had diverted its faithfulness away, and God noticed that, and it made a difference. So, was there victory? Well, yes, broadly speaking, but when there's a pocket within Israel that is unfaithful, that has repercussions. So, one of the reasons for the exceptions to the fulfillment, places where Israel ran into trouble, it's because Israel was itself in trouble, behaving unfaithfully towards God. Also included in the parenthesis of C subpoint 2 subpoint A, unfaithfulness, you see a reference to Rahab and to the Gibeonites. Here's what I'd like to suggest by adding these stories in under this particular heading. We've just established that failure for universal fulfillment of the conquest promise, failure for that to happen, can happen when someone is unfaithful. Achan is an example of that. The very trait that he negatively illustrates, he was unfaithful. That very trait that he negatively illustrates would be labeled faithfulness. This looms large as just an enormously important theme throughout the book of Joshua, and this can be illustrated by how the spies responded to Rahab. They said, "You can count on us to be faithful to our promise to you that you will be exempted from the destruction of Jericho. We will be faithful." So it's very, very important. Achan was unfaithful to God. It caused negative consequences, which then comprised one of those exceptions to the forward motion of the fulfillment of the inheritance of the land. The trait of faithfulness then, again, I'm recapping this, the trait of faithfulness, the importance of it, is illustrated by how Israel positively, commendably behaved towards Rahab. Oh, incidentally, the survival of Rahab is also a witness to the fact that the conquest was not universal. Did that make sense? If the earlier statement that edge to edge the land was entirely given to God and he won the day, if that was 100%, should Rahab have survived? Should not she also be among the casualties? Because she's one of the citizens of that land. And of course we protest, but she was friends with the right side, so it makes sense. Well, notice that she is capable of transferring her allegiance and, as it were, becoming one of the faithful people. This is recognized by the Israelites. They reward her transfer of allegiance, and they are faithful to her, and this then becomes one of the examples of the noble character trait of faithfulness. Here's another, the Gibeonites. These are the people in chapter 10 who realize the devastation that's coming, pretend to be travelers from afar, establish this treaty with Israel deceptively, and then their near neighbors, the Canaanites, find out about it, are very upset, are afraid that Joshua is getting too strong a toehold in this territory, and so they attack the Gibeonites, who have formed an alliance with Israel. Israel has a choice now. Will they be faithful or unfaithful to their promise to the Gibeonites? They decide they must be faithful, even though they were tricked into it. So once again, this character trait of faithfulness looms large in the book of Joshua. The spies were faithful to Rahab. She is exempted from the destruction of Jericho. The Israelites are faithful to the Gibeonites, even though they were tricked into it, but they stand by their word. And this looms large as a commendable trait, once again, in the book of Joshua. Well, that is the foil, the contrast to what how we first approached this trait of faithfulness. We approached it through the lens of Achan, who was unfaithful, and that explained why, in certain cases, the universal conquest was interrupted, was thwarted. What we're suggesting by this, it wasn't the fault of God. That was Achan's fault. It wasn't as though God defaulted on his promise. It's that someone threw a wrench into the works, and that prevented the full victory that God wanted to give them. It hit a serious speed bump at that point because of the failure of one of the members of the community to be faithful. Now, item 2, subpoint B, timidity. Timidity. There are 2 passages that we'll examine in connection with timidity. One is negative, the other is positive. We'll start with the positive one first. Positive reverse of timidity then would be courage. And we find this epitomized in the statement by Caleb. Let's go ahead and read this. It's Joshua 14, beginning with verse 6. Joshua 14:6. The people of Judah came to Joshua at Gilgal, and Caleb, son of Jephunneh the Kenizzite, said to him, "You know what the Lord said to Moses, the man of God, in Kadesh Barnea concerning you," that is Joshua, "and me. I was 40 years old when Moses, the servant of the Lord, sent me from Kadesh Barnea to spy out the land." By the way, you'll recall that Joshua was the other who brought back a positive report. "And I brought him an honest report." Verse 8, "But my companions who went up with me made the heart of the people melt, yet I wholeheartedly followed the Lord my God. And Moses swore on that day, saying, Surely the land on which your foot has trodden shall be an inheritance for you and your children forever, because you have wholeheartedly followed the Lord my God." And now Caleb addresses Joshua directly. "And now, as you see, the Lord has kept me alive, as he said, these 45 years since the time the Lord spoke this word to Moses, while Israel was journeying through the wilderness. And I am here today, 85 years old. I am still as strong today as I was on the day Moses sent me. My strength is now as my strength was then, for war, for going, for coming. So now give me this hill country of which the Lord spoke on that day." Listen to the tone of courage that he shows here. "For you heard on that day how the Anakim were there with great fortified cities. It may be that the Lord will be with me, and I shall drive them out, as the Lord said." And now see how affirming Joshua is of this statement of courage and faith in God. "Then Joshua blessed him and gave Hebron to Caleb, son of Jephunneh, for an inheritance. So Hebron became the inheritance of Caleb, son of Jephunneh the Kenizzite, to this day, because he wholeheartedly followed the Lord, the God of Israel." Now, the name of Hebron formerly was Kiriath Arba. This Arba was the greatest man of the Anakim, and the land had rest from war. Not only does Caleb keep on going courageously in God's direction despite his high age, 85, he is not intimidated by this land where giants have lived, this land that is fortified, great fortified cities. Verse 12, that does not intimidate him. So here is a case of courage then being consonant with the inheritance of the land that God has promised to give. God gives the promise, but we find here that it needs to be mingled with a receptor, an individual like Caleb, who says, "God, you promise it? I'm moving ahead with courage because I believe that you can make this happen." And now we come to a passage where Joshua confronts some of his fellow countrymen because of their timidity, their reluctance to move ahead into the land that God has assigned to them. We're concentrating here on chapter 17, verses 16 to 18. Chapter 17, verses 16 to 18. The tribe in question is the tribe of Joseph. And keep in mind that can here it looks like that pertains especially to Ephraim. Manasseh would also be considered a tribe of Joseph. Picking up with verse 16, the tribe of Joseph said, "The hill country is not enough for us." And just prior to that, they've said, "We're quite numerous, we need more land." Hill country is not enough for us. And then notice what they next are concerned about. "Yet all the Canaanites who live in the plain have chariots of iron." both those in Beth-shean and its villages and those in the valley of Jezreel. So they're intimidated by the superior armaments of these people. On a human level, that seems reasonable, but keep in mind that it's God who is leading them into this. Verse 17, then Joshua said to the house of Joseph, to Ephraim and Manasseh, you are indeed a numerous people and have great power. So he calls them up short for questioning their ability to move in. You shall not have one lot only, but the hill country shall be yours. For though it is a forest, you shall clear it and possess its farthest borders, for you shall drive out the Canaanites. And then notice this, though they have chariots of iron, though they are strong. So Joshua acquiesces in expanding their territory, giving them some hill country that they're going to need to clear out, but he does not let them off the hook. He makes it plain that he's disappointed by their timidity. They are not factoring in that God has been giving the victory to this point, not by virtue of human might, but by virtue of God, in various cases, supernaturally intervening, whether through hailstorms or extended days or one thing or another, enabling Israel to rout the enemy. And we saw the negative was also possible, that a smaller town like Ai could upset a massive force from Israel. It's God who's giving the victory from one station to the next. So once again, the principle we're drawing from this particular passage, timidity is causing the tribes of Joseph to fail to take hold of a section of land. It is then not the failure of God, but the failure of the people. Earlier we saw that failure in battle was caused by the unfaithfulness of Achan, and now lack of universal fulfillment is caused by timidity of the people. Finally, there seems to be an element of just sheer laziness. You can decide for yourself when we look at chapter 18, verse 3. Here's chapter 18. Let's begin with verse 1. This is that convocation at Shiloh. Then the whole congregation of the Israelites assembled at Shiloh and set up the tent of meeting there. The land lay subdued before them. Verse 2, there remained among the Israelites 7 tribes whose inheritance had not yet been apportioned. So Joshua said to the Israelites, listen please to his tone, how long will you be slack about going in and taking possession of the land that the Lord, the God of your ancestors, have given you? And then he calls for representatives, 3 from each tribe, who are going to go out and do a survey of the land, write a description of it, come back, divide it into portions, and assign it to them. This language, how long will you be slack about going in, seems to indicate that there is a laziness, or perhaps it is another form, a subform of the timidity that we saw expressed by the tribes of the tribes of Joseph. To summarize then this particular point, that is, we have conflicting messages within the book itself regarding the fulfillment or the lack of fulfillment of the promise to give all the land. I would suggest that, at least to some degree, we should best understand this as the writer wanting us to take home the message that from a high-altitude, broad brushstroke vantage point, this promise has come true. And he uses universal language to say, look, in effect, God has really done what he finished what he promised. He's accomplished it. But if we were to pin him down and say, but what about these particulars, the writer is not going to gloss them over and say, oh no, that didn't happen. No, we actually did have universal victory everywhere. No, he's going to say, there's a time when things blew up in our face. It was at Ai. And then we've got these people from Joseph's tribe that are just scared of the iron chariots, in contrast to this old man Caleb, of all things. He just blows right on through. So unfaithfulness or faithfulness, timidity or courage, laziness or what shall we call it? Tenacity. Again, we could use Caleb as a counterpoint for item C. There are reasons why God is able to give the inheritance in some cases, but those pockets of resistance, there are reasons why that happened too, and it's not God's fault. We'll break the video at this point and continue with the next element of the theological context in the ensuing video.